Britain, the country that invented the tank, officially admitted in 1943 that it could no longer reliably build one. The proof sits in 12 words, written in pen across the cover of a classified report stamped Most Secret. Major General A.C. Richardson, closing out 7 weeks of maintenance logs, defect reports, and roadside repair tallies from the most exhaustive tank reliability trial the British Army had ever run, wrote that the simplicity and reliability of the American machines set against British production was to him the chief lesson of the whole exercise. The date was late September 1943. The place was Bovington Camp, Dorset. Britain triggered the Industrial Revolution. British engineers built railways across 5 continents. On September 15, 1916, Britain sent the very first tanks into combat at the Somme. Steel machines. German infantry had never seen before. Machines that made frontline soldiers drop their rifles and run. Britain didn't just build good tanks early. It invented the entire category of weapon. 27 years later, a country that had barely been building tanks for 3 years had quietly caught up and passed it. How does the country that invented something end up, 3 decades later, producing machines that can't survive 2,000 miles of ordinary road without falling apart? To answer that, you have to go back to a choice Britain made. A choice between engineering that looked impressive and engineering that simply worked, and follow what that choice actually cost, first in industrial embarrassment and then, almost, in blood. Start with a number that tells you most of what you need to know before the story even properly begins. 1771. That's the exact number of Covenanter cruiser tanks Britain built between 1940 and 1943. Enormous factory floors, thousands of skilled man-hours, scarce wartime steel and rubber, all poured into a production run that ran for 3 straight years. Not one of those 1771 tanks ever fired a shot in anger. Not one. The Covenanter had looked on paper in 1941 like the future of British armor, fast for its era at 31 miles an hour, modern armor, years of careful design work behind it. The flaw that quietly killed the entire program was almost absurdly simple. The cooling system worked fine in a British autumn and essentially nowhere else. Move a Covenanter to North Africa, where interior fighting compartment temperatures could climb past 130 degrees Fahrenheit, and the engine started overheating within hours. Nobody anywhere in that entire design and procurement chain had apparently thought to test the tank in genuinely hot weather before committing to mass production. You might expect that failure to have taught the institution something durable. It mostly didn't. The Crusader came next, and unlike the Covenanter, it actually reached real combat extensively across the Western Desert campaigns of 1941 and 1942 against Rommel's Afrika Korps, and it worked in favorable conditions for a while. But consider what a typical operational day actually looked like for a British tank crew in the desert that autumn. Sand worked into everything. Air filters clogged constantly. The Liberty engine, a design originally built for American aircraft during the First World War, leaked oil chronically and ran hot in desert heat. Transmissions failed under the sustained vibration of cross-country movement over rocky ground. Electrical systems shorted out in the dust. Suspensions wore through faster than replacement parts could be shipped from England. Official records from the 4th and 7th Armored Brigades during Operation Crusader that November show that, on a typical day, somewhere between 30 and 40% of the unit's Crusader tanks sat non-operational, not knocked out by enemy fire, simply broken. German intelligence reports from the same period noted, with what reads like genuine puzzlement, that British armored columns routinely left trails of abandoned vehicles along their own line of advance, vehicles showing no sign of battle damage at all. One British tank officer, reviewing his own unit's Western Desert maintenance records afterward, described commanding a Crusader squadron as running a mobile workshop that occasionally also fought battles. His crews were mechanics first and soldiers only when the tanks actually let them be. Then came the detail that turned frustration into something closer to open resentment. American Sherman tanks began reaching North Africa through Lend-Lease in mid-1942, and they simply started every morning. They ran all day. They needed maintenance too, obviously. Every tank does. But that maintenance was routine and crucially predictable. Sherman crews didn't spend their evenings genuinely wondering whether the clutch would hold through tomorrow's advance. They handled the scheduled items, slept, and the tank was there again in the morning. Even Bernard Montgomery, not a general remembered for generous praise of American equipment given his notoriously prickly relationship with American commanders, admitted as much in private correspondence. His Crusaders, he wrote, had been temperamental friends at best, while the American Shermans, whatever their other limitations, could genuinely be depended on to work. Plenty of British officers had a ready explanation that let them avoid the harder question entirely. The Sherman was simple, unsophisticated, a blunt, mass-produced instrument next to British engineering's theoretically superior precision. Nobody in that argument ever quite answered the obvious follow-up. If your theoretically superior tank loses to my theoretically inferior tank at the start line every single morning, because yours is the one broken down, which tank is actually better? By early 1942, the War Office understood a genuinely new cruiser tank was urgently needed. Faster than the Crusader, better armored, better armed, and for once, reliable. The proposed answer didn't come from designing a fresh engine from scratch. It came from adapting one of the most proven power plants in British engineering history, the Rolls-Royce Merlin, the engine behind the Spitfire and the Hurricane, the 12-cylinder design that had helped win the Battle of Britain. In October 1940, senior Rolls-Royce designer W.A. Robotham sat down with Leyland Motors general manager Henry Spurrier and proposed something that looked on paper close to brilliant. Strip the Merlin down, cut its output to roughly 600 horsepower, redesign it specifically for ground use, and drop it into Britain's next cruiser tank. The resulting engine, called the Meteor, was meant to give that tank, the Cromwell, exactly the power and reliability every British design since the war began had lacked. The Merlin had already proven in the air that it could run for hundreds of hours between major overhauls. Surely that same reliability would simply carry over onto the ground. Early results seemed to confirm it. The Cromwell hit 40 miles an hour on test tracks, faster than anything Germany was fielding in real numbers, faster than the Sherman too. Production began at Leyland Motors that January, with Birmingham Railway Carriage and Wagon, Metro Camel, English Electric, and several other manufacturers joining the effort soon after. By spring 1943, hundreds of Cromwells were already coming off assembly lines, and the War Office had begun planning to equip entire armored divisions around Britain's new machine. The Crusaders' embarrassment, everyone assumed, was finally about to end. There was exactly one problem. Nobody had actually tested the Cromwell hard enough, for long enough, under conditions realistic enough to expose what was still genuinely wrong with it, a gap that was about to matter a great deal. By that summer, worrying reports were already filtering back to the War Office from training units receiving early production Cromwells, and the specific complaints had an uncomfortably familiar shape. Significant oil leaks around the engine compartment, serious enough to create fire risk and leave visible trails on roads that enemy reconnaissance could spot from the air. Brake fade on long descents, the system simply unable to shed the heat generated by a 28-ton vehicle moving downhill at speed. Clutch failures leaving tanks dead on the road during ordinary training runs. Steering crews described in a word that should terrify anyone reading it about a military vehicle as unpredictable. What made these specific reports genuinely alarming wasn't their novelty. It was that every single one of them had already shown up in earlier development trials, documented in reports from late 1942 that had recommended concrete fixes for each of them, fixes that had simply never been implemented before mass production started anyway. They knew. The oil leaks were on paper before the first Cromwell reached a training unit. The brake weakness was on paper. The clutch problem was on paper. Production went ahead regardless. Major General Richardson had been watching this pattern develop with growing unease, and he wasn't a man inclined toward half measures or polite institutional silence. That July, he secured authorization for a rigorous, deliberately unbiased test designed to settle the question once and for all, an exercise given the code name Dracula. Every rule was built around producing results nobody could later argue away, massage, or explain around. Every tank entered would be a standard production model pulled straight off the assembly line, not a specially prepared or factory-tuned example chosen to flatter a particular design. Crews would be experienced British personnel already trained on both British and American equipment, removing unfamiliarity as a variable in either direction. Maintenance would happen strictly under field conditions, using only the tools and procedures a genuine frontline unit would actually have. Every defect, every hour of repair work, every breakdown would be logged by independent observers with no personal stake in whose tank came out ahead. 11 tanks entered the competition. 3 Sherman M 4A2s, running General Motors twin diesel engines. 3 Sherman M 4A4s, powered by Chrysler's unusual multi-bank engine, essentially 5 automobile engines married into a single power plant. 3 Cromwell Mark Is and 2 Cromwell Mark IIIs, all carrying the new Meteor engine. And 3 Centaur Mark Is, running the same Liberty engine that had already proven itself catastrophically inadequate in the Crusader. Preparation began at Bovington on August 4th, 1943. Every tank inspected, every pre-existing fault corrected, every crew given time to properly familiarize themselves with their own vehicle. Richardson wanted no room afterward for anyone to claim the starting conditions had been unfair to one side or another. On August 15th, the exercise itself began. 11 tanks rolled out of Bovington that morning, heading north on a route that would eventually carry them through England, up into Scotland, across into Wales and back. Something close to 2,300 miles across the breadth of Britain, run under conditions built deliberately to simulate a sustained campaign rather than a single road test. The first breakdown came before the column had covered 10 miles. A Centaur began trailing smoke from its own engine compartment, the aging Liberty engine, under the sustained load of straightforward road marching, already starting to strain. By that first evening's halt, north of London, the same Centaur had developed a serious oil leak requiring 2 full hours of emergency field repair while the rest of the column ate and rested around it. A Cromwell, separately, had already experienced genuinely dangerous brake fade on a long descent, forcing its driver into low gear just to control speed because the brakes themselves were generating more heat than they could safely dissipate. The Shermans reached that same evening halt without incident, ran their routine checks, and went to sleep. That specific contrast, Cromwell and Centaur crews working by flashlight deep into the night while Sherman crews slept undisturbed, repeated itself, by most surviving accounts, almost every single evening for the next 6 weeks. By the end of the first week, the pattern had already fully set. Centaurs consistently limped into evening halts hours behind schedule, their Liberty engines leaking oil constantly enough to worry observers about fire risk, cooling systems and clutches failing under sustained running. On one particular evening, a single Centaur required 8 straight hours of flashlight maintenance just to remain operational enough to continue the following morning. The Cromwells performed noticeably better than the Centaurs, but still fell well short of what their own designers had promised. The same oil seals, brakes, and clutch already flagged in the earlier reports failing on schedule, the Meteor engine's genuinely substantial torque simply overwhelming a clutch assembly that hadn't been built to absorb it reliably over the long term. Captain Hugh Priestley of the Coldstream Guards, serving as one of the exercise's official observers, documented something the raw defect counts alone couldn't fully capture: the invisible ripple cost of unreliability spreading through an entire unit. Cromwell crews, he noted in his own daily reports, should theoretically have had the easiest evenings of anyone in the column. Their tanks were the fastest on paper and should have reached each halt well ahead of everyone else. In practice, one or two Cromwells routinely arrived hours late because of breakdowns along the route, which meant late meals for exhausted crews, guides left standing in the dark waiting for tanks that hadn't arrived yet, fuel trucks held on station when they were badly needed elsewhere, and officers unable to properly brief the unit for the next day's movement until the very last straggler finally rolled in. A single mechanical failure, in other words, didn't just cost one tank a few hours. It cost the entire formation something closer to a full night's readiness. When Richardson finally compiled the complete numbers at the exercise's close, they were worse than almost anyone involved had actually expected going in. The single metric that mattered most, hours of specialist maintenance required per mile actually driven, became a number no amount of institutional pride could talk its way around. Roughly 2 minutes of fitter time per mile for the Sherman, against better than 4 minutes for the Cromwell and close to 5 for the Centaur. The Cromwell needed more than double the Sherman's maintenance burden while covering meaningfully less ground across the identical 7 weeks. The Centaur needed nearly 3 times as much and simply couldn't keep pace at all. Set those 3 figures side by side, 0.03, 0.07, 0.09, and on their own they read like dry bookkeeping. Translate them into the operational reality of a full 500-tank armored division advancing 50 miles in a single day of real campaigning, and they stop looking like bookkeeping entirely. A Sherman-equipped division covering that combined 25,000 tank miles would need roughly 750 hours of nightly maintenance to stay combat ready. A Cromwell-equipped division covering the identical distance would need close to 1,750, its mechanics and crews working more than twice as long every single night, just to arrive at the same starting line the next morning. Richardson himself put the human cost of that gap more starkly than any raw statistic could. A commander equipped with Shermans, he wrote, could genuinely expect 99% of his vehicles to reach the battlefield intact across their first 2,000 miles of operational life. A commander equipped with Cromwells or Centaurs would instead live in something close to continuous low-grade anxiety about whether enough of his own tanks would even be running by morning to carry out the unit's most basic assigned tasks. I think that image, a commanding officer doubling his mechanic's strength and burning every night's sleep just to guess how many of his 50 tanks might actually show up for tomorrow's start line, says more about what unreliable equipment actually does to a fighting force than any of the raw defect tallies manage to on their own. It isn't simply lost tanks. It's a corrosive, compounding uncertainty that eats into a commander's every planning decision before the enemy has fired a single round. There was a second finding buried in Richardson's report that was, in its own way, even more damaging than the reliability numbers themselves, because the numbers only proved the Cromwell had failed. This second finding explained exactly why and pointed fairly directly at who bore responsibility. The exercise's own observers noted in writing, in the official classified record, that the defects showing up throughout Dracula were, in their own phrasing, well-known issues that had already appeared in earlier testing and should have been corrected during development before production ever began. The engineers had known, the project managers had known, the procurement officers who signed off on the production contracts had known. Mass production went ahead regardless, because halting the line to fix known problems would have cost time, money, and a fair amount of institutional embarrassment that nobody senior particularly wanted to own. That decision, start the line before the design is actually finished, had looked, in the moment it was made, like a reasonable wartime shortcut. In hindsight, it guaranteed roughly 1,000 Cromwells would reach frontline units carrying documented defects that then had to be fixed after delivery, at considerably greater cost in time, materials, and engineering effort than simply waiting to get the design right in the first place would ever have required. Around the same time, entirely separate from Exercise Dracula itself, results of American testing of British tanks were arriving back from proving grounds in the United States, where the British tank mission had shipped examples of the Centaur and Cromwell for independent evaluation, and the results lined up with Bovington's findings, then went further still. A British observer attached to that American mission, a man named Alec Richardson, no relation to the general running Dracula back home, wrote a letter that October containing a line that survived as close to the definitive verdict on the entire episode. "These tanks," he wrote, "have made us a laughingstock out here." He went on in the same letter to note that sending only one example of each had been unwise, that the Rolls-Royce representative traveling with the vehicles was thoroughly unhappy and wanted them withdrawn before the embarrassment spread any further, and that Britain had, in his own blunt words, proven itself the world's worst salesman. His closing recommendation was blunter still: send no more British tanks abroad until they were actually reliable, and when Britain finally did build a genuinely first-class cruiser tank at home, however long that took, send it out properly, with trained crews and a first-rate officer in charge, rather than risk further humiliation on a lone derelict vehicle nobody back home had thought to properly prepare. A laughingstock, that specific word in a private letter, about the country that had armed an empire and invented the tank as a category of weapon a generation earlier. But Exercise Dracula hadn't just exposed what was broken in one specific tank design. In finding the Cromwell so comprehensively lacking, it had, almost by accident, exposed exactly why the American machines worked as well as they did, and understanding that answer means looking past individual components entirely toward two genuinely different philosophies of industrial culture. Here's the question that really should have kept British tank designers up at night. How did American engineers, with barely 3 years of serious tank building experience against Britain's 3 full decades, produce something close to 3 times more reliable? Answering that means stepping outside tank factories entirely towards something considerably more ordinary. Pre-war Britain built the finest luxury automobiles on earth. Rolls-Royce, Bentley, Aston Martin, genuine masterworks of hand-built precision, individually tuned, capable of extraordinary refinement in the right hands. They were also fragile, demanding expert mechanics intimately familiar with each individual example's specific quirks, never designed for harsh conditions, high mileage, or repair by anyone without specialist training. They were works of engineering art. Pre-war America, meanwhile, had built the Model T and the Model A. Cars, farmers drove straight through Midwestern mudfields, vehicles that broke down on a Wyoming back road and got fixed in a roadside barn with whatever tools happened to be lying around. American automotive engineering had been shaped for 4 straight decades by one overriding principle. The machine had to work in the hands of someone who might genuinely know very little about engineering. It had to start in cold weather, run on imperfect fuel, and be repairable without a factory anywhere nearby. Henry Ford hadn't simply built cars. He'd built a working philosophy: simplicity, standardization, reliability, and demonstrated across decades that a machine of merely adequate performance built consistently to a single fixed specification was worth considerably more in practical terms than a machine of brilliant performance built inconsistently, one unique example at a time. I don't think British designers were lacking in talent so much as working inside a tradition that had simply never had to answer to that particular arithmetic before. The adequate machine that actually works beats the brilliant machine that doesn't. When America applied that same philosophy to tank production, the result was the M4 Sherman. Let's be honest about what the Sherman actually was in 1943. Not the best tank in the world by a wide margin. Its armor was genuinely inadequate against German Panthers and Tigers. German 88mm guns could penetrate it at ranges where the Sherman's own 75mm gun couldn't meaningfully reply. When a Sherman was penetrated, its tendency to catch fire afterward was notorious enough that American crews gave it a grim nickname, the Ronson, after the cigarette lighter whose own advertising promised it lit up the first time, every time, while Polish crews serving alongside British forces used a considerably darker term, the burning grave. These were real flaws, and men genuinely died because of them. What the Sherman's critics consistently fail to properly weigh against those flaws is simple enough to state plainly. A tank that occasionally burns when hit is still, on balance, worth vastly more than a tank sitting broken down on the shoulder of a road somewhere in France, having never reached the fight at all. The Sherman's own designers made a deliberate, calculated choice to favor reliability over raw performance. Not for lack of talent, but because they understood something about industrial warfare that British doctrine, even by 1943, still hadn't fully absorbed. Modern war isn't won by fielding the single best weapon on any given battlefield. It's won by consistently delivering adequate force to the right place at the decisive moment. You need tanks actually at the front, not 50 miles back in a repair workshop. You need tanks that start every single morning, and machines an ordinarily trained mechanic can fix using the tools already carried in the vehicle's own kit, not machines that require a specialist flown in directly from the factory floor. There's a genuinely striking outside perspective on exactly this point. Soviet forces received roughly 4,100 Shermans through Lend-Lease and developed a real, somewhat unexpected affection for the American design. Dmitry Loza, a Soviet tank commander who fought in Shermans from 1944 onward and later published a memoir of the experience, described the contrast with Soviet equipment in vivid terms. Crews accustomed to the T-34, effective but notoriously crude, uncomfortable to operate, built from the outset to be replaced rather than repaired, found the Sherman felt almost like a luxury vehicle. Padded seats, a spacious interior, rubber tracks that lasted roughly twice as long as the T-34's steel ones while running considerably quieter. A real tactical advantage when a crew needed to approach an enemy position unheard. Most tellingly, in Loza's account, it simply started every time it was needed. He recorded one detail that captures the entire reputation in miniature, that an undamaged Sherman left briefly unguarded during a Soviet advance would get stripped for spare parts by passing crews within minutes, not out of dishonesty, but because everyone already knew Sherman components actually worked. No other tank in Soviet wartime service generated quite that same trust from men who hadn't designed or built it themselves. Now, look at the exact opposite end of that same spectrum. If the Sherman represented American industrial philosophy carried through to its full practical conclusion, German tank development represented something close to its mirror image. Germany built the Panther and the Tiger, both genuinely superior to the Sherman in direct armor and firepower comparison. A Tiger could kill a Sherman at ranges where the Sherman couldn't effectively reply. On paper, German technical supremacy looked essentially absolute. But Germany built roughly 6,000 Panthers and around 1,300 Tigers across the entire war. America built 49,324 Shermans out of 11 factories. That gap reflects exactly what happens when a nation consistently prioritizes engineering sophistication over practical manufacturability at industrial scale. German tanks demanded specialized tools to maintain components machined to tolerances so tight that field repair was frequently impossible without factory-grade equipment. A Tiger II required something on the order of 12 hours of maintenance for every 50 miles of ordinary operation. German panzer divisions fighting in France that summer routinely lost as many tanks to plain mechanical breakdown as to actual Allied action. Heinz Guderian, Germany's own leading armored theorist, the architect of Blitzkrieg itself, wrote in his diary that year that his workshop companies were overwhelmed, that Germany now had tanks it couldn't fight with because it couldn't keep them running. That's a man who had built an entire doctrine of war around the tank, openly admitting his own machines were defeating themselves before the enemy got the chance. Britain, in other words, had been making a milder version of precisely the same mistake Germany was making, prioritizing engineering elegance over plain operational dependability. The crucial difference is that Britain discovered its version of that mistake in a controlled test in Dorset in 1943. Germany discovered its own version under live fire in France in 1944, at a cost measured directly in irreplaceable armored formations, rather than in embarrassing paperwork. Richardson himself seemed to understand exactly what Dracula had actually accomplished. Near the end of his final report, he noted, in effect, that the exercise had revealed at a genuinely acceptable cost in time and resources what actual combat would eventually have proven at a vastly higher cost in lives. 7 weeks of humbling data collection, potentially saving hundreds of British tank crews from dying inside vehicles that could never have been fully trusted to reach the battlefield in the first place. The real question left hanging after Richardson filed his report was whether the British military establishment would actually act on what the audit had exposed, or whether institutional pride would find some quieter way to minimize the findings, protect the existing program, and send the Cromwell into combat essentially unchanged. The answer, when it finally came, didn't arrive as a memorandum or a procurement decision. It arrived on a road outside Brussels almost exactly 1 year later. Richardson's report reached Winston Churchill and circulated through the highest levels of British military command, and its recommendations were specific and genuinely urgent. The Cromwell would be comprehensively redesigned for reliability before any combat unit deployed with it. Engineers took Dracula's documented list of failures, leaking seals, fading brakes, an overwhelmed clutch, a suspension that couldn't hold up, and spent months redesigning the core assemblies behind each one, addressing every identified failure mode with an actual engineered fix rather than a field workaround. That took real months. Months that, in a war where months cost both lives and territory, weren't spent lightly. The final specification for what Leyland internally called the Battle Cromwell, the version genuinely judged ready for frontline combat, wasn't finalized until February 2nd, 1944, barely 4 months before D-Day. A second reliability trial that November showed dramatic improvement. The modified Cromwells performed substantially better than their August predecessors had, not quite matching the Sherman across every single metric, but transformed from Dracula's outright embarrassment into a machine a commander could reasonably plan around. The Centaur, by stark contrast, showed almost no improvement at all. The Liberty engine simply lacked the power-to-weight ratio the tank's own mass demanded, and no amount of modification could change that underlying physics. Most surviving Centaurs were eventually converted into specialized variants: armored recovery vehicles, artillery observation posts, dozer conversions, and quietly withdrawn from any serious frontline consideration. The Battle Cromwell entered combat that June, equipping the armored reconnaissance regiments of the 7th Armored Division, the Guards Armored Division, the 11th Armored Division, and the 1st Polish Armored Division for the Normandy landings. Early impressions were genuinely mixed. The bocage, the dense ancient hedgerow country of the Norman interior, made speed essentially meaningless for any tank regardless of design, since roads rarely allowed more than 15 miles an hour before the next blind obstacle. The Cromwell's headline 40-mile-an-hour capability simply didn't matter in that terrain. On June 13, 1944, at Villers-Bocage, the 7th Armored Division, the Desert Rats, veterans of North Africa, drove to exploit a gap that had opened in the German line. The lead element entered the small Norman town and, in a few catastrophic minutes, a single German Tiger commanded by SS Hauptsturmführer Michael Wittmann destroyed vehicle after vehicle down a column that had halted nose to tail along the main road, several crews caught outside their own tanks. Wittmann's 88mm gun could kill a Cromwell at ranges the Cromwell couldn't hope to penetrate a Tiger's frontal armor in return, and the 4th County of London Yeomanry lost most of its vehicles within minutes. The advance reversed outright. For anyone still skeptical of the Cromwell, Villers-Bocage looked at first glance like total vindication. The gun was inadequate, the armor too thin, a Cromwell simply outmatched by a tiger in any direct confrontation. They were entirely right about that specific matchup. They were wrong, as it turned out, about what the Cromwell had actually been built for in the first place. The Allied breakout from Normandy began July 25th, with Operation Cobra, American forces punching through the German line near Saint-Lô, and German resistance across the wider region collapsed with startling speed. By early August, the German position in France was disintegrating from multiple directions at once, the Falaise pocket trapping and effectively destroying the core of 2 entire German armies by mid-month. And suddenly the Bocage sat behind the Allied advance rather than in front of it. Open, rolling country ahead, real roads, genuine room for armored formations to actually run at speed. This, at last, was precisely the terrain the Cromwell had been designed for from the start. British armored formations began moving north at a pace that reportedly startled even their own commanders. Not the 10 or 15 miles a day of grinding hedgerow fighting, but 50 miles in a day, then 70. Tanks rated for 40 miles an hour on a road finally running close to that speed for real, with jubilant Belgian and French civilians lining the route the entire way. On September 3rd, 1944, almost exactly 1 year and 11 days after Richardson filed his damning classified report at Bovington, the Guards Armored Division liberated Brussels. Cromwells of the Welsh Guards' 2nd Armored Reconnaissance Battalion rode among the lead elements entering the city, the division having covered 75 miles in that single day alone. Major General Alan Adair, commanding the Guards Armored Division, later summarized the achievement in his own memoirs with a line that stands today as close to the final verdict on everything Exercise Dracula had set out to fix, that the Cromwells had performed miracles of speed and endurance, a genuine triumph for the manufacturers, the fitters, and the drivers alike. Miracles of speed and endurance from machines that, barely 12 months earlier, had required roughly double the maintenance time of their American counterparts, and been openly called a laughingstock at an American proving ground. That turnaround wasn't any kind of accident or lucky break. It was the direct, deliberate product of Richardson's report forcing British industry through a genuinely uncomfortable and expensive reckoning with exactly what had gone wrong and exactly how to fix each individual failure. The Battle Cromwell that rolled into Brussels that September wasn't the same machine that had embarrassed Britain at Bovington a year earlier. It had been rebuilt, quite literally, around the specific lessons of that earlier humiliation. Montgomery himself, in his own post-war commentary, characteristically claimed credit for the achievement without acknowledging the American engineering philosophy that had actually pointed the way there, writing that the great advance to Brussels had only been possible because of British cruiser tanks, and that Panthers and Tigers, for all their individual superiority, could never have sustained it. They would simply have broken down. He wasn't wrong about that specific comparison. He might, though, have added a footnote. As of 1 year earlier, neither could the Cromwell. So, to close the audit properly, what actually happened across those 7 weeks at Bovington? In the autumn of 1943, Britain commissioned what remains one of the most bluntly honest investigations in the history of its own military procurement. Its newest tank, against proven American equipment under identical, rigorously controlled conditions, every result logged and reported without spin. Richardson's own conclusion managed to be both damning and, in its own way, genuinely constructive. The Cromwell could still be fixed because its failures weren't inherent flaws in the underlying design so much as the direct product of inadequate testing time, production launched before development had actually finished, and an institutional culture that had spent a generation valuing impressive specifications over plain operational dependability. Fix that specific list of problems systematically, and you'd have a genuinely capable tank underneath it all. They did fix them. It took 6 months and a full redesign of several critical systems. And it demanded a fairly rare kind of institutional humility from a procurement establishment with decades of accumulated tradition and no shortage of pride to protect. But they actually did it. The Centaur, by contrast, simply couldn't be saved. The Liberty engine was fundamentally the wrong tool for the weight it was being asked to carry, and the roughly 950 Centaurs eventually built stand today as one of the clearer examples in British military history of exactly what happens when factory space, scarce wartime steel, skilled labor, and maintenance hours all get poured into a vehicle that arguably should never have reached production in the first place. The Sherman, meanwhile, went on to serve in every theater of the war, 49,324 of them built across 11 American factories, and continued equipping armies around the world for decades afterward. Israel modernized its own Shermans so extensively over 3 separate decades, new engines, upgraded armor, more powerful main guns, that Israeli-modified variants remain genuinely effective in both the 1967 Six-Day War and the 1973 Yom Kippur War. The last Sherman-equipped units in the Chilean army weren't finally retired until 2003, 61 years after the very first production models rolled off an American assembly line. 61 years of continuous operational service for a design one British general privately described, in 1943, as adequate but unremarkable. Adequate but unremarkable, it turns out, was close to exactly what the rest of the 20th century actually needed. Richardson had stamped his own conclusions, most secret because what they contained was too embarrassing for public release in 1943. What that report actually carried in the end was never about embarrassment. It was about the one question that mattered in a war fought across continents. Will it work again tomorrow morning? And the machine that finally answered it correctly rolled into Brussels a year later at 75 miles a day. If your own father or grandfather crewed a Sherman, a Cromwell, or any Allied tank of this war, in North Africa, Italy, Normandy, or the drive across France and into Germany, I'd genuinely like to hear whatever they told you about it in the comments, because the men who actually kept these machines running night after night rarely made it into the official histories, and their own account of what that work was really like is worth far more than any maintenance log Richardson ever filed.